Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum, colleagues and guests. Welcome to this month's Ummatics Colloquium. My name is Hana Aisha and I'm the forum coordinator at the Ummatics Institute. And apologies again for us starting a little bit delayed this afternoon due to our technical issues. But it is our final event of the year and it promises to be an exciting one nonetheless. Today's event features not one, but three different presentations on the broad theme of Ummatic Solidarity in the 21st century. The idea of the Ummah, while broadly acknowledged by Muslims globally, is often met with skepticism. Even in this forum, presenters and attendees have debated the practical importance of this categorization, given the many spatial, intellectual, theological, and social divisions between Muslims around the world. Unfortunately, Muslims also frequently display more antagonism and hostility towards their brothers and sisters in faith than towards others. And so the task of bridging these divides, while a praiseworthy aspiration, often seems impossible. But the idea that Muslims are incapable of unifying often serves to close the door on discussions of how Ummatic solidarity is already manifesting today. Far from existing in silos, Muslims are connected and collaborating across globalized networks, this platform being just one of many, highlighting a desire for greater integration. The rise of communication technologies and increases in travel and migration have also sparked transnational interactions between the Ummah like we have never seen before. And for many, the recent World Cup in Qatar also demonstrated the various ways in which solidarity with the broader Ummah is invoked in cultural and social spaces, suggesting that perhaps aspirations for greater unity in future are not as hopeless as assumed. These are some of the themes that our speakers will reflect on in their presentations and responses today. We first have Dr. Sadek Hamid, who will present his soon-to-be-released paper for the Ummatics Institute, Islam Beyond Borders, Building Ummatic Solidarity in the 21st Century. Dr. Sadek will argue that not only is there a desire for more widespread cohesion among Muslims, but that this already exists in numerous religious and social exchanges, and that in order to achieve greater unity, we must build on these existing efforts. Dr. Sadek is a research fellow at the University of Wales, Trinity St. David, and has been actively engaged in Muslim communities for more than 30 years. Prior to transitioning to academia, he was a youth and community development professional, and he is also the author of Sufis, Salafis and Islamists, The Contested Ground of British Islamic Activism, and co-author of British Muslims, New Directions in Islamic Thought, Creativity and Activism. We also welcome back Dr. Abdullah Al-Arian, who will reflect on the 2022 FIFA World Cup, a moment of Ummatic solidarity. He will discuss to what extent the World Cup in Qatar has ignited Ummatic sympathies among Muslims and the importance of football as a form of political inspiration. Dr. Abdullah is an associate professor of history at Georgetown University in Qatar and is also the editor of Football in the Middle East, State Society and the Beautiful Game, published just this summer by Hearst. And finally, we have Thomas Parker, who will reflect on Istanbul as a site of Ummatic migration and interaction. He will offer his insights on the motivations of millions of tourists, migrants and refugees and students who mingle in Istanbul and the consequent formation of new identities. Thomas is a writer, translator and graduate of civilization studies at Ibn Khaldun University in Istanbul. His research interests include Ottoman history, Islamic political thought and the Islamic sciences. He is the co-author of On the Theology of Disobedience, an analysis of Sheikh bin Bayya and Sheikh Hamza Yusuf's political thought, among a number of other academic and journalistic publications in Reorient, the American Journal of Islam and Social Sciences, the Maidan, a Sharq Strategic Forum, and TRT World. And after the presentations, we will of course have our usual Q&A, but we also encourage viewers to make use of the general chat box to share their thoughts on the presentations throughout the event. And you can of course submit questions to the speakers directly using the Q&A box, which we'll come to in the Q&A session. So we have had some technical difficulties, so we'll try and start with Dr. Sadek if he is available. Dr. Sadek, how's it looking now? Nope. Okay, perhaps we've still got some difficulties. In that case, let's go backwards and I'll hand over to you first, Thomas, if that works for you. Okay.
Yeah, sure. If we could just share screen.
Sure thing. Oh. There you go. You should have sharing abilities
Okay,
now.
let's see. Yes. Okay. Let's see. Let's forget how to make it full screen. So we're here, right? Okay. How's that? Can everyone see that?
We can. It's not full screen yet, but perhaps there's a lag.
Okay, yeah, I did put it in full screen. Okay, just let me know when it goes full screen. Nope.
You can perhaps try again, or if not, we can still. That's good.
See, it should be slideshow. We good?
No, not that I can see.
No,
Yeah,
okay.
try the read mode next the icon
Okay.
next to it.
Let's see. I put it on slideshow, but let's
there we
see
go.
if that's better.
Now we go.
Okay,
It's
there we
fine.
go. All right. Well. والحمد لله رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي امري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. So the fact that I'm going first has somewhat messed up my opening line, but basically, even though this is out of order, inshallah, perhaps it could also be of benefit for Dr. Sadek's later presentation, and perhaps let's say, a clear manifestation or a clear embodiment of some of the trends that he will be talking about. And I think that Istanbul is one of the clearest examples of some of the trends of the Ummah among globalization that he discusses in his paper and presentation. How is the audio? Is the audio fine? Okay, perfect. All right, let's start then. So this presentation is somewhat coming out of a long personal experience. I've been here in Istanbul about 8 years, and I've seen the transformation, especially in the past few years, as we have seen millions of Muslims come through. And I'm going to discuss some of these categories, and inshallah, time permitting, even deconstruct some of them, inshallah. I want to start off from the very onset and say that when we're talking about migration or movement, motion, we should keep in mind that there's multiple agencies at play here. So a lot of times when people analyze Turkey, they only discuss Erdogan, or they only discuss the government, right? But there's direct and indirect consequences of government policy. There's civil society, and perhaps even more importantly, especially for us as analysts and academics, is there are millions of Muslims who on an individual level are exercising their agency and choosing to move here or visit for a multitude of reasons. Now, one reason why I wanted to talk on this topic is I think that the demographics of migration to Istanbul probably look very different than most of us imagine. And so because of that, yes. Is your audio working? Okay. So I'm going to reckon that the demographics probably look very different than we would imagine. And so because of that, I'm actually not going to focus here on Syrian refugees that much, because obviously there's a lot of literature that discusses that. And it's obviously an issue that most of us are aware of. I'm also not really going to discuss Western hijrah, right? Even though that is a growing phenomenon and is interesting, and one that is often debated. But I think that when you talk about Westerners, such as myself, who are migrating to Istanbul, it's a drop in the bucket, so to say. So the way this is going to work is I want to give sort of like a bird's eye view in order that we can understand the true scope of the phenomenon that we're talking about here. But however, at the same time, some of the complexities, both of the categories themselves, but also on the ground here, also mean that if you just look at statistics, you're not going to be able to get a true or accurate understanding. So hopefully, as we go through, I'm going to try to comment on some of these statistics. So we'll start off first with obviously Syrian refugees. Turkey actually is the #1 host of refugees globally. I haven't seen the latest statistics, but actually at certain points over the past decade, 2 decades, Muslims have made a clear majority of the refugees in the world. So this is definitely something that we should be thinking about very deeply and more often. Now, Syrian refugees that are registered as refugees, let's say, make up about 3.7 million people. At least 200,000 of those, more than 200,000 of those have now received citizenship. However, there are also Iraqi refugees, Afghan refugees, and Uyghur refugees, roughly in that order. There's about 50,000 Uyghur refugees, and last year alone, 8,000 of them received citizenship, which is almost a fifth of them. So it's fair to assume that a great deal of them already have citizenship. And the Uyghurs also have an advantage that they speak a Turkic language, so they can very easily integrate here. The second category, and perhaps maybe one of the most important ones, is university students. There's about 260,000 international students in Turkey, the majority of which are Muslims. The Turkish government scholarships is an especially popular program. So this is from the Turkish government scholarships brochure, and they give the geographic distribution here. And you can see very clearly, obviously, the Middle East, Central Asia, North Africa are clearly all Muslims, but even in Sub-Saharan Africa, the Balkans and South Asia, that is majority Muslim. Interestingly, another category that a lot of people might not know about is there's also high school students that come here. So the Diyanet has a program, the International Imam Hatib schools. So Imam Hatib, Hatib is basically Turkish for Khatib. This traditionally was where they would train khutaba, is where they would train Turkish imams, but it sort of grew and developed into just a religious high school, basically. And so there's 9 of these international religious schools, and a couple thousand, maybe about 2,000 people have graduated so far. And what I find interesting here is that a lot of these students are people that have a madrasa background. They're actually like hafal. They bring them here to Turkey, they get full scholarships, dormitory, the full works. And because their high school education is in Turkish, many of them continue on in university and they speak fluent Turkish, right? And many of these do end up going back to their countries eventually, but this is obviously to have somebody with that deep of an experience at that young of an age, and that also applies for university students. That has long-term effects, right? And something I forgot to mention on the university students is that while there are still certain aspects of brain drain that go on in Turkey, I would say as a net effect, there is a brain gain that is happening in Turkey because of all these university students that are coming in, as well as visiting professors, so on and so forth. Another category is that of seekers of knowledge, so tulab al-ilm. Unfortunately, because they're not officially students, they come in on tourist residence permits. There's no statistics here, but I can tell you that the majority of them actually are Central Asian. So any ma'had that is run by Syrians that you go to here, you will find that at least 50% of the students are actually Central Asians. And that's because many of them have a very difficult time obtaining Islamic knowledge in Central Asia. It's very heavily monitored. And so for the Arabic readers here, you can see very clearly there's like 3 Syrians, a couple of Arabs, but then it's Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan. Go down the list, just look for the stan at the end, right? And so that can give you an idea. And I can tell you from personal experience as well. And they're also studying not just with the Syrians, they're studying with the Turks as well. Beyond that, much like the upcoming Ummatics conference in Istanbul, inshallah, Istanbul is also becoming a hub for conferences, for institutions, so on and so forth. And like I said, this is obviously very important to make it not just a hub for, let's say, motion, but also a hub for intellectual efforts, as well as activism. Within these conferences are people who are thinking deeply about Islamophobia, who are thinking deeply about the Palestinian struggle, the Kashmiri struggle, so on and so forth. How am I on time?
You've got about 10 minutes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, good. So, and then we come to another category, which is basically people that are acquiring citizenship. So the first category I'll talk about in terms of naturalized citizens in Turkey, is through the basically investment scheme, because this is the easiest way to obtain statistics. But there are also you can also obtain citizenship basically through marrying a Turkish person, as well as staying here in Turkey for a certain number of years, being a student, working in a company, so on and so forth. So between 2018 to 2021, there's about 20,000 people that became citizens of Turkey. And I think most people, including Turks themselves, if you ask them who is buying houses and becoming citizens, they're going to say, oh, it's these Arabs, it's the Gulf Arabs. And actually, we're going to look at the statistics, and they're nowhere even close. Who actually are buying are Iranians and Iraqis. And you can see here that Iran and Iraq make up for almost all the other countries combined, which I don't think is what most of us would expect. This is for 2021, and these are the statistics for 2022. Obviously, here, Russia jumps to #1. Ukraine also jumps up because of recent events. But if you look here, I also find it interesting. You also have Egypt, you have Palestine, Yemen, Afghanistan, Kazakhstan in both years is at 5 and 6. So obviously, and this, by the way, is just people that are purchasing houses, not necessarily people that are purchasing houses for citizenship, which is why there's a discrepancy here between the amount of people that acquire citizenship and those that bought houses. And the fact that Afghans are #3 over here, but they're all the way down over here at, I guess that's like #7, tells you that the Russians, the Germans, all these people in between are not buying houses for citizenship. They're buying it for property, basically, for investment, for profit. But when you look at Iranians, you look at Iraqis, you look at Afghans, Yemenis, Palestinians, they are particularly buying houses in order to obtain citizenship. Now we come, and this is where things start to get a bit more mixed up. So one very interesting phenomenon that I've noticed here is that there are a number of people that are, they're foreign Muslims that were either born and or raised in Saudi Arabia and Malaysia. Now, as many of you will know, Malaysia used to be sort of the hub for Ummatic migration as well. And many of these people are now actually immigrating from Malaysia and from Saudi Arabia here to Turkey. Obviously, something like this, you can't find statistics on it. But my wife herself was in Malaysia at one point. She's in a WhatsApp group that is, it's not Malaysian, it's specifically foreigners that lived in Malaysia and now live in Turkey. And there's hundreds of people in that WhatsApp group. And these people are very interesting because these are, you will remember that Ustad Anjum talked about globalized Muslims being the target audience for Ummatics. And these are globalized Muslims par excellence, because these are people that already grew up in a Muslim country and have probably traveled across the Muslim world and now are living in another Muslim country. And you talk to them about their identity, it is one that is very much centered on the Ummah very often. Another very interesting phenomenon that a lot of people don't pick up on is Turks that are actually returning back from Europe. According to Germany, about 40,000 Turks return back to Turkey from Germany every single year. And I've talked to many of these people, and when I talk to them, it's not like, oh, I'm Turkish, I belong in Turkey. That's not what they're saying. They're saying, when I was in Germany, I faced a lot of discrimination, I faced Islamophobia, and here in Turkey, I can live more comfortably as a Muslim. Of course, that's not all of them, but a significant amount. And this last phenomenon about Turkish returnees from Europe, you can see it here when we look at these statistics for foreign marriages. So here on the left, you have foreign grooms, and on the right, you have foreign brides. And so very interesting here on the left, in terms of grooms, the single largest group is actually Germany. Now, Turkey, I can assure you that even a person who's not, not praying 5 times a day is not going to let their daughter marry a non-Muslim German per se, right? That's not going to make up for almost 30% of all foreign grooms. So I'm pretty sure, and that's also why you see Austria here at #3, is that is actually Turkish people that are returning back and marrying back into Turkey. And you'll also notice here, very interestingly, in both, that Syria is #2 for grooms and #1 for brides, showing that there is actually, in fact, a decent amount of intermarriage between Syrians and Turks that is happening. Now, something that I've noticed, and this is, I think, maybe the crux of the presentation, is that if you just look at refugees, the statistics for refugees, you're not going to get an accurate understanding, because a lot of people here are not formally refugees. They stay as students, but they come from a country that you might consider to be refugees, right? Obviously, that's a contentious term, right? So I have a lot of friends that are from Yemen, from Libya, Iraq. You talk to them, you say, what are you doing here in Turkey? They say, oh, well, I'm doing my school. I'm going to do my undergraduate, my master's, my PhD, work for a year, and then apply for citizenship. Because that, I mean, obviously they don't say this, but what is read between the lines is that affords them a sense of security that they are unable to have in their own countries. As well as I know a lot of people from Gaza, for example, who are doing the same thing. They're here as students. They're even here on tourist iqamats. And so someone like that is very interesting. And also homeowners. I found that interesting when you're talking about someone who comes from Afghanistan, but is able to buy a house for $250,000, right? Or $400,000 now, right? So this view of just refugees, or this view of, political circumstances forces you, but then economics, that's voluntary. We need to complicate that view a lot. I'm closing to an end here.
Yeah, thank you. Brilliant.
No worries at all. So to very briefly discuss some of the reasons for this is, obviously, I don't want to suggest that everyone has the same motivation for doing this. Part of the thing is that Turkey, and especially Istanbul, can mean very different things for different people, right? For some people, it's a better lifestyle. For some people, it's a Muslim country. And for a lot of people, it's both, right? And that's not necessarily contradictory. Obviously, I think many of us are aware from the media that there's been some challenges in recent years, especially with the upcoming elections. It can be a challenge to navigate bureaucracy here. The economy as well have made this a bit of a challenge. But I want to close on a more positive note, because I've noticed tremendous changes in the amount of time that I've been here. And you see it's very easy to get swept up in the media, or it's very easy to just look for big events like Russia invading Ukraine. But at the end of the day, it is the individual, it's the cumulative sum of millions of people making decisions that can change history. And I would argue that Istanbul is a perfect manifestation of Muslims making exactly such decisions in a way that can truly transform people through day-to-day interactions, inshallah ta'ala. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to listening to the other presentations, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you so much, Thomas, for starting us off. A very, very interesting presentation. I'm sure we'll come back to in the Q&A. I think that now, inshallah, Dr. Sadek should be working. Dr. Sadek, yes, can we hear you?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Alhamdulillah.
Okay,
that's great.
Assalamu alaikum, everybody. I'm really sorry for the technical problems on my side. Apologies to everybody. So as I'm speaking through my phone, our sister Hannah is going to play the PowerPoint presentation which I have prepared, which inshallah summarizes my paper. When you're ready, Hannah.
Yes.
Please.
Okay, bismillah, here we go. Can everyone see this?
Right.
Yep.
Okay. So if we want to move to the first slide, please. So if we just go to the introduction. Yeah, so the introduction, sorry, go to the first, slide 2, please. Yes, thank you. Yeah, so just to give you an idea, my paper, the paper which I've written for Ummatics, inshallah, will be available soon on the website. And in this presentation, what I wanted to do was just summarize the main sections, which are about 7 points really I want to cover. And after the introduction, I will talk about why I think ummatic consciousness or ummatic sensibilities actually here. I'll be talking about the political unity of Muslims and the importance of Khilafah. We'll be talking about gummies, and you'll have to wait to find out what that means. I will be then talking about how this ummatic consciousness is very much virtual, and I think the main argument of the paper really is around how we understand Muslim unity and how we can enhance it. And the conclusion is a summing up of that. So if we go to the next one, please. So I think, as our brothers just mentioned, I think, and Hannah's mentioned in her introduction as well, the idea of Muslim unity, the quest for Muslim unity, is something that is a constant feature of our internal conversations, often lamentation about why and how and why is it, why isn't there more unity? Why can't we do better? So it's become very much it's almost an unreachable goal, an ideal that is desirable, but for many people it's unrealistic. We don't seem capable of coming together in our own nations, let alone transnationally as a global project. The Ummah seems to be fragmented and divided more than ever on the basis of nation states, ethnicity, social, political, and theological differences. However, at the same time, most Muslims know that the idea of unity is actually a responsibility, which is both personal and collective. So in this essay, what I try to do is to make three main, very broad arguments. The first of which is that there is currently a widespread desire for greater Muslim unity. It's already there. It's something that we need to generate. It's already there, and that's despite all the very complicated, often quite demoralizing divisions and differences and all the conflict and all of that. I mean, I think we're all aware of the problems that we have, but the reality is that we do want to become more cohesive as an ummah, and that is a great starting point. The second point I make in my essay is that not only is it that there an aspiration, but it's already it's happening. It's happening at various levels. It occurs in the social and cultural and physical interactions that are taking place, both virtual and real, online, offline, through numerous globalized networks and Islamic forms of communication through interaction and in areas of education, social activism, in artistic projects, in charity works, in commerce, in travel and tourism, and many, many other areas. So in my essay, what I do is give a snapshot of these different types of unities and integrative interactions. And I then the next part of the essay begins to talk about how the political unity is so important, I offer a very brief snapshot really on how the caliphate, the idea of Khilafah, was an overarching concept which provided a certain level of political unity. Then I move on to talk about, or what I will say actually is various examples of this in terms of young people, and how young people represent the greatest hope are the younger generations who are enacting these forms of Ummatic Solidarity. And my third argument and concluding argument is really that to think about how we can actually move beyond this aspiration of wanting to unite to thinking what we actually mean by unification. What does it actually mean? And how do we do that in practical steps? And how do we overcome our differences to imagine an alternative future that transcends these real and imagined borders of the mind? So, moving on to the next slide. Ummatic sensibility in recent history. So the idea of Ummah is something. It's the idea of it's something that I think we all take for granted, but it's something really truly powerful and unique, I think, to us as Muslims. That we see ourselves as a universal brotherhood and sisterhood, a moral community, an ethical community par excellence, something that we are united spiritually because of the shared roots of our foundation, of our foundational sources of our faith, the Quran and the Sunnah, and the idea of Tawheed, the oneness, it extends to the entire Ummah. And you know, this is something that it's not theory, as we know. It was actually very much a real functional manifestation that has occurred throughout our history. And that's something that really something tangible, and that we see in the remarkably similar religious and social practices that occur as far apart as Morocco and Malaysia, and throughout the entire Ummah. There are commonalities that are already there. As I've mentioned, political unity was symbolically expressed in the institution of the Khilafah, and that's remained in the back of our minds. And in I guess in the last 50, 60 years, there are various movements that have kind of campaigned for Muslims to reintroduce the idea of Khilafah into our consciousness. And that is a really important point, because if we move on to the next slide, I will talk a little bit about the idea of caliphate later, but the thing about, so I spend the next section of the essay talking about the realities of Muslim solidarity, what is actually already taking place. And I give various examples of how we, as Muslims, are actually very transnational in our everyday lives. It is very much part of our thinking and our everyday practices as communities, whether we're the diasporic communities in the West or in a minority context. The constant flows of students, immigrants, people traveling for work, or refugees, and people who move around the world for trade. I think all of us, especially in minority contexts here in the West, we're very keen to maintain relations and connections with our countries of origin, and that most often occurs through the practice of sending remittances and supporting our relatives back home. The sense of faith belonging, it is a very real kind of the Ummatic Solidarity is real, and it's expressed in the way we identify and support and champion causes, powerful and really central causes to our faith, issue of Palestine, the struggles and the oppression Muslims in Kashmir, in India, Myanmar, and China are going through. And that's something that's actually increased in recent years. And not to mention the fact that various important influential Islamic movements throughout the world have continued to keep this state of Ummatic consciousness alive and remind us of the importance of these bonds across borders. More tangibly, Muslim charities, and there are many of them, I think we all are aware, they also help to sustain this idea of Ummah and offer practical ways of helping one another. And this is something that is I think it's remarkable. And Muslims are known to be the most generous, usually, of most communities in their society, particularly here in the West. And I think it's very easy to see the expressions of solidarity that take place, again, in everyday interactions, conversations, in prayer, in public demonstrations, and as we saw very vividly on display at the recent World Cup in Qatar, which our brother Abdullah is going to speak about later. So if we move on to the next slide. So the next part of the essay just gives, again, a very brief overview of the importance of political unity and the aspiration of being a kind of unified, transnational political entity of sorts. The whys and the hows are still yet to be kind of articulated, but there are Muslim thinkers and scholars who are, I guess, who have in the recent past tried to present a particular vision for this. I mean, and even today as well. And I think anybody who hasn't read Dr. Uwaima's Anjum's paper on the Khilafah, who needs the Khilafah on the Yaqeen Institute website, needs to read that, because it really does articulate it very well in a lot of detail. And it really does challenge the negative associations that have come to surround the idea of caliphate. It's popular Western media, particularly, it's associated with extremism and terrorism, and we know that. But the fact is, it is part of our tradition, and it's not something that we are going to apologize for, because ultimately the caliphate is about the just ordering of society and governing societies according to what we understand is the will of God. And given that so many Muslim nation states are, struggling as a result of being divided in the post-colonial era in the last 100 years, post and pre-colonial, obviously through centuries of through occupation, through empire, the damage that has been done has been well covered, and I think we're all aware of that. But the fact that if we were to get together as one civilization, it would no doubt change things dramatically in terms of people's quality of life, prosperity, security, and the various difficulties that are currently overwhelming the different Muslim countries. Now, I think what is significant here is that beyond these aspirations and particular individual attempts to rationalize the importance of the modern caliphate, one of the most, I think, interesting interventions in this has been by a scholar, Mushtaba Ali Ihsani, in his recent book, which I very much recommend, and he articulates a very interesting thesis, actually, based upon the empirical research that he's done, analyzing various polling data and surveys about what Muslims around the world actually think, and if there is an actual appetite for a caliphate. Now, that I won't say much more on that, except to encourage everybody to read that, and also point out that it's a very the book itself is a very important step, and further research needs to be done to examine the extent of this support for a caliphate and how it could actually happen. But it's no easy challenge at all. Moving on to the next section. Gummies. Okay, so it's essentially an acronym that's come to signify a global elite, if you like, of educated English-speaking Muslims, which I'd guess most of the people who are here in this presentation would probably fall into this category. These are basically people in the millennials and Generation Z, and anybody really who understands and contributes to positive transformation of Muslim societies. It's predominantly a young demographic, and these people are very much successful and established, economically have purchasing power. They are active in various different fields, in the arts, in business, in creative industries, in religious scholarship, media, and many other fields. And they are making the difference. These are the people Muslims who are coming forward and actually entering the mainstream as well. And we're seeing that particularly in the arts, popular culture, and different types of international sporting arenas. Because of their mobility and education, they often move around the world very easily, and they are fully utilizing the various digital opportunities, and they are becoming a real force for positive change. And these people who are the virtual ummah that I refer to, and I think we all can see that in the way people are maximizing the use of the internet and various technological affordances. So the virtual ummah, next slide, please. People are, the fact that we are using an electronic online forum right now to present and to exchange is an example of that. We know WhatsApp, Telegram, Facebook, Twitter, all of these online spaces allow for this greater ummatic exchange, interaction, and often leads to real world cooperation and unification in many ways. Not only that, we've heard also how Istanbul has become a site of ummatic travel, and the fact that there are more and more Muslim platforms that are offering halal holiday packages, if you like, vacations to different Muslim countries that are rich in Islamic history. Again, this encourages us that and helps people to rediscover our ummatic consciousness and a pride in our heritage, which is so rich. These gummy Muslims, if you like, are at the forefront of contributing to the global Islamic economy, which is now in the trillions. And it's something that even the non-Muslim sectors are realizing the vast financial and economic potentials. But beyond that, I think there's also interesting opportunities here for Muslim states to actually come together. And it is happening to a certain extent. We have the D8, which is consisting of Bangladesh, Egypt, Indonesia, Iran, Malaysia, Nigeria, Pakistan, and Turkey. And it's as one experiment to develop some kind of common Muslim market, if you like, of sorts. We also have the economic power that we already have is demonstrated in the fact that there are ummatic boycotts, a term which was used to describe the coordinated efforts to target certain countries and companies when they produce or act in a way which endangers Muslims or oppresses Muslims, and that is something which I've highlighted. Now, moving on towards the conclusion, what I've done here is spent quite a bit of time thinking about what we mean by ummatic unity and what do we actually need to make it, to move from the status quo. So when we talk about ummah, I really think, and this is something I would like to develop further actually, but what I've done in this paper is to question some of our underlying assumptions. If we're moving on from where we are now, we need to think, first understand what is actually being done in terms of, in the recent history, how Muslims have tried to come together, what are the lessons to be learned, and what are the underlying logics and, if you like, dead ends. Because what we can't do is continue as normal, and we can't continue to make the same kind of mistakes. So from my perspective, I think there's a lot of unlearning to take place as well. Unlearning, and meaning that we just can't continue to take for granted certain strategies and processes, and learning to actually think differently, really, and having a problem-solving mindset, and rather than continue to make excuses and to feel pessimistic and overwhelmed and thinking that actually nothing can change. We have somehow doomed to accept things as they are, and that's not how life works. And certainly as Muslims, we need to have a can-do attitude, and it is about perspective. It's looking at this challenge as a glass half full rather than half empty. So for me, reimagining Ummatic Solidarity needs to take place at various different levels. But it's about us, first and foremost, having a moral vision and acting ethically. It is about bringing together, in terms of processes, it's about collaboration between different expertise, both religious and secular, people from different disciplines. The Ummatic Institute is one example of that as an intellectual effort in this regard. But at the same time, there needs to be a bottom-up approach in terms of grassroots organizations or initiatives and institutions come together, so we can actually start to bring our collective intelligence to bear on how to solve these problems. And this really does, again, it's happening in terms of a crowdsourced approach, a hive mind or even big mind approach. And it's simple, really. It's about bringing together our collective intelligence, bringing the best minds together from different disciplines in every area of life to figure out our problems. And it's only when we come together and that this synergy will actually result in strategies to solve our problems and to increase ummatic unity. So in conclusion, it's clear to me, and I think for most of us, I think we would agree that what unites us as an ummah is greater than that which divides us. While we're conscious that there are many converging and diverging dynamics which are, if you like, separating us. There are equally dynamics which are bringing people closer together, and it's the glimpses which I've just highlighted here, which point to the potential for future ummatic solidarity, ummatic unification. And you know, it really is up to us. We really need to see this as a solvable problem, and that, you know, given that we are nearly 2 billion people strong now, and so much of our ummah is actually, more than half is under the age of 30, we really do need to maximize the potential of the millions and millions of young Muslim thinkers, actors, entrepreneurs, business innovators, technology pioneers, artists, and you name it. You know, we don't have a lack of talent in our ummah, but we just need to encourage ummatic thinking. And this is, I think, the practical steps that need to be really strategized moving forward. We need people with a mindset who that can transcend existing forms of division and sectarianism and petty politics, which have prevented this happening so far. And ultimately, when we bring the best thinkers and practitioners together, we will be able to identify our collective challenges, develop consensus, and inshallah, convert analysis into action. So that's my paper. I hope that made some sense. Sorry, it's a bit rushed, but if you want to read the fuller paper, inshallah, you can see it on Ummatics website. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sadek. It was well worth the wait, alhamdulillah. And inshallah, as Dr. Sadek just said, you can read his paper on the Ummatics website. It's forthcoming. So inshallah, it will be published in the coming weeks. And now, last but by no means least, we'll come to Dr. Abdullah to talk to us about the World Cup, which I have a feeling many people have been looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum. Good to be with all of you. So yeah, I mean, this might be a little bit different, I think, than the previous two presentations for a couple of reasons. First, I think when Dr. Anjum asked me to contribute to this, rich and lively conversation that we're having today, but specifically around the question of the World Cup that just took place in Qatar, I mean, I have to admit that I hadn't really given it that much thought of being a space for Ummatic Solidarity for a number of different reasons, which I'll get to in just a moment. But also I want to just add that because it's also so fresh, I mean, this is an event that literally just ended a few days ago, that I think, there's going to be a lot of unpacking to do for many of us about so many of the questions that came up, especially for those of you who I'm sure were following a lot of the different debates, a lot of the politicking, a lot of the kind of various, quote unquote controversies around, the events of the last month, that there's still a lot of work to be done in a scholarly fashion. So what I'm going to offer today is by no means a kind of a formal or academic presentation. It's more, I would say, just kind of some initial reflections, and hopefully a way to get a conversation started. And I'm definitely looking forward to other people's reactions to the same kinds of questions that have come up for me. So with that sort of a caveat to begin with, I'll begin by saying, the reason that I did not initially conceive of the World Cup specifically as being a kind of a space for Ummatic Solidarity. I mean, first and foremost, we know what the World Cup is, right? That among many things that it represents, it is a hyper-commodified event that is stage managed largely by an organization, FIFA, its corporate sponsors, media companies, based mostly in Europe or in the United States, as well as in this specific case, a state agency, in this case being the Supreme Committee for Delivery and Legacy, that is, of course, an arm of the state of Qatar. And so in that sense, of course, already we know that this event is explicitly being devised to represent something else. But again, as I've been arguing over the course of the last several weeks, irrespective of the formal top-down control that's so often exerted over it, we know that football can also act as a site of popular mobilization from below. So irrespective of what the corporate sponsors, FIFA, the media companies, all of the various actors that I've mentioned might want to do in terms of exerting control, we know that, of course, football historically has always been a site or a space that can operate for the development of popular expressions, for the coming together of different communities, And that in this case, of course, those communities tend to signify a wide array of characteristics. And so we've heard a lot about the World Cup representing a number of different kinds of things. One, of course, of it being a hub of globalization, right? That this is evoking the universality of fan culture that brings together people from across the globe. The fact that, for instance, we heard a lot about, when the knockout stages happened, that is when we went from 32 teams to 16 teams that remained in the tournament, that they represented 6 different continents. That was a pretty historic occasion. Because it really meant that the World Cup was truly globalized. And so again, this was kind of the framing or the emphasis was the idea that it's not necessarily there to represent one culture, one group, but rather thinking about the kind of the diversity that was being celebrated and that was on display for the entire tournament. But there were also, of course, spaces to celebrate other layers of communal identity and popular expression. So for instance, we heard a lot about continental solidarities, right? The idea that no African team had made it as far as Morocco. And so this became an achievement specifically on one level, at least, framed as an achievement for the continent of Africa. Or for instance, when we talk about the fact that no non-European team has won the tournament going back to 2002 for 20 years. And so the idea of kind of everyone eventually getting behind the one South American team that remained, being Argentina in the final. So again, the idea of kind of forging these continental solidarities, or maybe on one level anti-colonial solidarities, creates a lot of different kinds of spaces. And then, of course, most of all, perhaps, we heard a lot about this being a World Cup for the Arab region, right? That there was a broad kind of Arab nationalism that was at work in the support of the teams from Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Tunisia, and Morocco. So for instance, there's a contrast between the support that we saw for those teams versus teams, for instance, like Iran or Senegal, which of course were Muslim countries, but were non-Arab states that were competing at the World Cup. And so even though there was also widespread solidarity or expression of solidarity around Palestine, which was visible, you really couldn't miss it at any of the matches or in the streets or in the fan zones, wherever you were at the World Cup. But again, so often that was framed really as being an extension of the kind of a pan-Arab or Arab nationalist solidarity. Sometimes it was framed as a kind of a global solidarity, the idea that the question of Palestine had become so universalized, the fact that you saw people from across the world, from South America, from Africa, from East Asia, that were all expressing their solidarity, not to mention, of course, those voices from Europe that we saw from England and Denmark and Germany, who were also expressing solidarity around Palestine. And so rarely was it ever discussed, at least from kind of my perception of it, as an Islamically based expression, although I think there is certainly a space to kind of make that case, as we've talked about in the past. So all of those, I think, are reasons at least to kind of maybe put the brakes a little bit on the idea that this was a space of Ummatic solidarity. And I'll get back to the other kinds of counter arguments to that in just a moment. But I think it's also important to mention the other side of all of this, which of course is that there is a long tradition of Islamic scholars arguing that modern popular cultural interest in football in particular has always been kind of singled out as representing a needless distraction from Islamic worship or other communal obligations, and even from a basic kind of Muslim identity. And so we noticed that a lot of those arguments were probably noticeably absent this time around, but that these voices have traditionally condemned the mass focus on mega events like the World Cup or the Olympics every 4 years, viewing them as being responsible for the further erosion of Islamic identity and corruption of youth. And so I think, maybe there wasn't as much of that kind of visible this time around, perhaps because it was being held in a Muslim country for the first time. But certainly we know that that sentiment exists and that it has kind of deep roots going back many years. And so, of course, this in some ways would impede the idea of the World Cup representing a space for Ummatic solidarity. If there are questions, for instance, about what leisure activity or a global mega event of this sort kind of represents from sort of a basic kind of Islamic moral perspective. So all of this kind of begs the question that along with this being a Qatar World Cup or an Arab World Cup or a Global South World Cup, or even as the organizers have officially kind of described it as a World Cup for all, right, this major global event, was this in any way an Ummatic World Cup? And so on the basis, of course, of all of the different reasons I mentioned just now, the answer would probably be no, and that it wasn't, or at least that it could not be an exclusively Ummatic event. But that's not to say that along with the many other layers of identity and expressed solidarities that were present, that a nomadic one was not also among these to be observed in a number of different ways, both formally and informally. So I'll mention kind of a few examples, but again, I would say kind of taking these with a grain of salt, so to speak, and then maybe kind of expanding the conversation to kind of bigger or broader questions. So the state of Qatar, of course, repeatedly emphasized the significance of this event being held for the first time in an Arab and Muslim country. So both of those kind of identifiers were usually attached to the notion of a Qatar World Cup representing more than just the Qatari state and really being about kind of the broader circles here. The Muslim part of this equation, for instance, extends to the idea that the tournament's reach went beyond the Arab region, that we saw that it was about making it accessible to people from across the Islamic world. And so, for instance, we saw large numbers of fans attending, especially from Iran, which is right next door, from Indonesia, Malaysia, Bangladesh, India, Turkey, Senegal, Bosnia, and many, many other places. Again, a lot of these countries whose citizens would probably have found it difficult to attend a World Cup, let's say in Western Europe or the United States, due to not just the cost of travel and distance involved, but really because of the restrictive visa requirements and the far more difficult accessibility that it would have and probably will have going forward in the next World Cup. This World Cup also seemed, at least, again, a lot of this is largely observational or anecdotal, but it seemed to attract a far greater number of Muslims from Western countries, due in part to the appeal of it being held in a Muslim country. And so I think there's certainly something to that idea as well. And so there's a number of other kind of, maybe we can think of them as superficial, but nonetheless significant indicators that are worth recalling here. One of which, of course, was this question of alcohol, which got a lot of attention at the very beginning of the tournament. There was a lot of press about the idea that Qatar had made the decision just a couple of days before the start of the tournament of banning alcohol from the stadiums. But this was welcomed, of course, by the Muslim fans who were in attendance. And over time, actually, what you might be surprised to find that it was universally commended, not just by the Muslim fans, but really by the entire kind of fan base, and even from some segments of the media. I think there was an article, whether in the AP or Reuters, I think, that mentions kind of how this led to a safer environment. It was more accessible to women, more accessible to families than prior World Cups. And so in some sense, at least, this idea of something that was initially condemned seemed, at least ultimately, to kind of had put the doubters or the critics, to put the doubts to bed a little bit. There were also kind of the many public displays of ritual worship. The most visible of these, of course, were those of the players. I think we just saw it in the image in the last PowerPoint presentation, that the players from Morocco and Tunisia, for instance, would be seen widely reciting Quran ahead of their matches, or prostrating in sujood on the field, after the matches. But beyond that, I think, it's not just about the players that were on the field, but really even for those who were present in the stadiums, that the stadiums had maintained kind of designated prayer spaces. There was so much overflow that there would be kind of makeshift, congregational salah outside, kind of just outside the stadiums, with probably hundreds, if not thousands, of fans kind of all coming together just before or after a match. Really, I mean, the only thing that this would evoke in comparison would be something like the Hajj, both in terms of numbers and then, of course, the diversity of the crowds. So it's something that we rarely ever see, especially at a kind of a mega event of this sort. And then, of course, on the margins of the games, there was also a kind of a state-led initiative to offer basic education about Islamic belief and practice and history to visiting fans. But a lot of that actually occurred more informally, I would say, than formally, just through the sheer interactions between Muslim and non-Muslim fans in a space that was kind of far more equitable, far more safe, and far more, I would say, kind of creating a notion of camaraderie, really, in terms of the kind of everyone being there for a sort of common purpose, and through that common purpose, discovering a number of other ways to learn about one another and to kind of encourage those exchanges in the process. Which brings kind of a broader point here, which is that expressions of Ummatic solidarity in our current moment usually revolve around specific issues of concern for the global community. Again, we've heard about this already, not the least of which in this case, of course, being the question of Palestine and the fate of Al-Aqsa. And so in an ironic twist, on the one hand, the World Cup really represents a gathering space ostensibly organized around something altogether different, right? That this was supposed to be a festive atmosphere to celebrate a common passion for the game of football, and yet the large presence of populations from the Arab region, from Africa, Asia, and the global South more generally, resulted in what was probably the most significant outpouring of solidarity with Palestine that we've seen really in a decade. I mean, you'd have to probably go back to the Arab uprisings in 2010, 2011 to see the kind of universal support that was being shared as we saw here. And I think this, to a certain extent, speaks to the mutability of the Ummatic Solidarity to fit various contexts, and also to be coupled with other forms of solidarity. Again, in this case, to see these things as not so mutually exclusive. And I think this was kind of one of the things that I noticed as someone kind of sitting here, seeing a lot of these things firsthand, but also witnessing the discussions online, and seeing a kind of a real disconnect or a contrast between, you know, the kind of debates of people saying, well, is the Moroccan team really Arab, or are they really African, or are they really Muslim, or what community are they representing? Whereas I don't think those were the discussions or the kind of sentiments that people were sharing here in terms of a kind of, you know, mutually exclusive sets of identities. And instead, it could be all of those things kind of operating at once, you know, Arab, African, global South, anti-colonial, et cetera, all of these things kind of seemingly going hand in hand, in addition to, of course, the kind of the Ummatic component that everyone has alluded to here as well. And so in perhaps the most politicized World Cup of all time, it was quite a thing to see the kind of conversations, even about sort of which teams to support on the basis of things like contemporary politics in those countries. So people kind of comparing, you know, the extreme versions of Islamophobia in different countries in Europe, for instance, or talking about colonial legacies when we looked at matchups between, you know, Morocco and France or Tunisia and France. And those were the kinds of things that tended to come up constantly in the discussions that people were having, even as they're just simply trying to enjoy the action, right? Trying to enjoy the football on the pitch. And so this brings up another point, which is I think that it's impossible to discuss the notion of an Ummatic Solidarity without acknowledging the hegemonic narratives that were largely imposed through the Western media outlets, through governmental and non-governmental institutions that seem to condemn the event before it began. I'm sure many of you are already very well familiar with this, so I won't get into the details of it. But it certainly tinged everything that was to proceed from that first day with a sense of kind of closing ranks and people responding from a very defensive posture in a way, for instance, that actually served, I think, to obscure the massive inequalities at work within the Muslim world. So here, of course, we have a World Cup that was sponsored by the wealthiest state in the Muslim world, but that was delivered through the labor of hundreds of thousands of the region's poorest Muslims, and that included at least many Muslims. And so the same defensiveness that also extended to other conversations imposed around differences in cultural values. So for instance, I would have an American sports writer who would ask me questions about, you know, what does it mean to host a World Cup in a Sharia state? I kind of had to ask him, you know, what is sort of where the question was coming from and what he means by Sharia state in this case. And so these were the kinds of perceptions or the kinds of narratives. And so I think, again, in that sense, it's impossible to talk about any sort of Ummatic presence without acknowledging the fact that there's already a sort of built-in set of assumptions that are at work in the way that this event was even, you know, managed, both from the sort of outside perceptions or, of course, from those who are executing it in real time. And so moving beyond the World Cup, then, I guess this gets us at some broader questions about what it means to define Ummatic spaces out of the shadow of externally imposed narratives. And so this is something that I think is at the core of the previous two discussions that we've had, that a lot of these things are coming as reactions to built-in sets of circumstances, whether it's even possible, and also in the same way, you know, that we conceive of the Hajj, for instance, as a place where all differences erode in favor of spiritual unity. Can differences of economic class, culture, nationality, et cetera, also be eroded in other types of spaces, including a mega event hosted within a Muslim context? And so just finally, I wanted to think, and this is sort of where, as a historian, I always like to kind of go back and see whether there are historical precedents in which cultural events could have played a similar kind of role. And of course, this was a really difficult thing to find. Is there any kind of precedent for what we saw just recently with the Qatar World Cup? But again, it was difficult largely because historically the need was simply not present, right? We didn't have the same kind of necessity that people are kind of clinging to now, this idea of having a space in which people can meet. Certainly there were major religious festivals that we know of historically. We know that they were largely organized around things like the Mawlid al-Nabawi or the commemoration of particular Sufi saints. But rather than being exceptional, what those moments of kind of, again, Ummatic solidarity, let's say, or even just Ummatic engagement, they were actually seen as the fulfillment of a reality that was already in place, right? The cosmopolitan Islamic society that was managed by self-designated Islamic dynasties and empires. And so again, it seems as though there's a kind of a disconnect between the historical use major events or gathering points, as we've seen, versus what it represents now at a moment, of course, as we've already talked about, that kind of represents far more fragmentation than what we've seen before. And so I guess this is sort of by way of concluding this kind of thinking about, what does this mean in our current moment? Again, this I think touches on exactly the kind of points about this idea of the 21st century version of Ummatic Solidarity. Because even in the kind of the modern era, I mean, the closest thing I could find in terms of examples were Muslims sort of meeting on the margins of these big sort of, international or global expos, a lot of them that were being held in Europe in the late 19th century, where there'd be spaces for Muslims from various places, again, largely through a colonial context in which they would kind of get together and discuss common problems and things along those lines. Or later on, even in the 20th century, in the kind of the third worldist conferences that featured also kind of spaces for most prominent Muslim presence to create, or even kind of states later that would go on and create bodies like a Muslim World League and these kinds of institutions that were meant to play this sort of role and create this kind of space, both in the sort of cultural, but of course, very much in a political sense. And so we don't really have a kind of a real analog historically for what we've observed, which is why I kind of go back to my initial point about the fact that a lot of this is still kind of very fresh and unfolding in ways that I think, I really hope that scholars and observers and journalists and people who kind of even experienced it firsthand will try to dig into it and offer, what they can in terms of their own reflections and observations, and also kind of think about what it means going forward. And so I would just kind of leave it there and say that I'm interested in hearing other thoughts, particularly about how this event was experienced and perceived from other places, from other centers, and perhaps, of course, more significantly, how we might even define what an Ummatic event or space actually entails. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abdullah. You've raised some really interesting questions. And on that note, inshallah, we will bring in the audience and start our question and answer session. So to our panelists, our colloquium members, obviously, you can feel free to raise your hand and unmute yourself if you wish to make a comment or pose a question. And please do say who your question is directed at, if it's for multiple members of the panel as well. And for the sake of time, we ask that everybody keep their contributions concise to about 2 minutes, please, to avoid me having to cut you off. And the same goes for our audience members. You can submit your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll try to get through as many as we can in the time we have left. Or you can request to unmute yourself as well, and we can get to you directly. So see that there's a hand up and we have a question in the question box. Let's go to Brother Muzaffar first.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.
Alhamdulillah. Jazakallah for one more colloquium. I was looking forward to this precise talk about the World Cup because it has been a focus of my observations ever since it started. And I was in Saudi Arabia just in last month, and there was talk about $250 billion was the official number that was at that time. I think it increased a little bit more. So my first concern at that moment, before the events happened, is this a wise use of the Ummah's money? If we assume that this money belongs to Ummah, is this a wise use? And what I just heard, especially the comparisons with Hajj and the narrative about how this sports event offered a space for expression of Ummatic unity, even expressions of Islam, prayers, congregation prayers in the stadiums, azans and all those things. And especially the comparison with Hajj really brought some other questions that I want to raise for everyone. Number one, just imagine what this $250 billion would have done in the West Bank for generations to come, not just for 10 days or 20 days or whatever, even Afghanistan, even Pakistan, lots of places where Ummah is really suffering at the very fundamental existential level. Number two, is this now the defining factor for the Ummah to gather for sports and compare them with Hajj? And this narrative about how Hajj eradicates distinctions between economic status, country of origin, I think these are all out of date narratives. Anyone who has gone to Saudi Arabia recently would know that perhaps the day of Arafah may be the only short few hours where those distinctions can really be said to have disappeared for a few hours. Even the accommodation levels, even the packages, what the Saudis just did last year about the entrance requirements, all of these, we need to be honest about what we are saying. So I just request for honesty and boldness from this colloquium to discuss real issues. Jazakallah khair.
Jazakallah khair, Sheikh Muzaffar. Dr. Abdullah or anybody else that would like to come in on that? I think the cost of the World Cup and whether it is worth it and whether it ought to be celebrated or viewed positively simply because of how extortionate it was is something that's been raised by several people.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, all points I think very well articulated and well taken. You know, I think in terms of the Hajj, of course, we know that this is more the ideal than the reality. There's a lot that can be said about what it's represented in reality in recent times, that I think were, you know, some of which was already explored here. But I think, you know, certainly in terms of the cost and the expense, I mean, again, it's a big assumption to say that this is the Ummah's resources, because this is exactly the point that we're coming to, is the idea that in the end, these are states, and states are looking out for their own interest and investing in ways that are not explicitly intended to be, creating these spaces for the expression of Ummatic solidarity. That anything that occurs to that extent is purely incidental. And in fact, in some ways, I mean, you could make the claim here that what took place in some ways was completely kind of spontaneous in a way, in the same way that I think the better analog, less so the Hajj, because the Hajj does not actually create that kind of space. We don't see it as a explicitly political space, but rather the other example that I raised, which is the Arab uprisings. I mean, again, a space in which popular mobilization and expression takes precedence, in some ways overpowering the will of the state or the will of whatever the powers that be. And again, not to say that this was in any way comparable to that in terms of the actual event itself, but just the idea of it being a space for people to kind of express themselves in ways that are not often permitted, or that space doesn't exist just purely owing to the level of repression. And again, I think this gets at kind of one of the initial questions that I think was posed at the start of this when I was given this kind of assignment to talk about today, was the idea of what football represents. And I think this is exactly the point, right? That football is viewed essentially as being an unthreatening space for mass gathering and a kind of a mega event, in a way that no kind of explicitly or overtly political getting together would ever be permitted or allowed. And so this is sort of what the reality is that exists, I think, particularly in this region. And so for that reason, that's the reality that's being confronted here.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. We'll go to Asil.
Thank you for the talks and for the opportunity to ask questions. I just have two, one for Dr. Abdullah and one for Dr. Sadek. And my questions kind of revolve about understanding the kind of talking or conversations that happen in these different sites and what kind of solidarities they can really forge. So to Dr. Sadek, my question is, could you elaborate a bit more about what you mean by ummatic thinking? How does that look like? How is it different from just simply making people accustomed or familiar with the language of the Khilafah, the Ummah, solidarity, and things like that? And then to Dr. Arian, the World Cup is a spectacle. As an event, it is a spectacle, just in terms of it's got in size and scope, and that it happens every 4 years, but it's exceptional. And I don't think it's unreasonable to say that people going into the World Cup to be a part of it, to experience it, understand that it is an exceptional situation, and that they're gonna go back to their mundane, ordinary lives afterwards. And so I'm wondering about if you have any thoughts about what it means or what it looks like to forge solidarities in moments that are spectacular, when the kind of solidarities we are used to or that we understand require time, building relationships, familiarity with someone that comes from living in a community with them. I'm just, since you brought the question of football, I'm thinking of the Ultras in Egypt, which has been very effective and has been very vocal, but in specific cities and context, not even maybe even in smaller parts of cities, not entirely, not somewhere or some place that is as exceptional as the World Cup in Qatar. Thank you.
Thank you, Asil. Should we go to Dr. Sadek first? Oh, he's just disappeared, I think. Let's put it down to tech issues again. Okay, Dr. Abdullah, back to you.
Yeah, I mean, it's an excellent question, and again, I think it in some ways points yet again to my hesitation to really apply any kind of a label onto this event, because exactly for the points really well stated here, that it is an exceptional event, right? That this is a once every 4 years and perhaps once in a lifetime for many of the people who came. The question of whether you can kind of build something on it. I mean, again, I think that there's room a little bit to create these kinds of communities or create experiences that might carry over in terms of the nature of solidarity that exists. And in the same way that, again, you know, when people get together in other kinds of spaces, they tend to build on, you know, whether it's the kind of the cross-cultural experiences that we don't often get to see in a day-to-day you know, instance. And so there is, I think, room at least to kind of think about this as being a space that could eventually, you know, yield those kinds of communities, especially given the kind of the historical exceptional nature of what this event represented, and whether there might be other similar kinds of avenues, or whether these kinds of same mobilizations might occur in future events, whether in this region or elsewhere. But again, I would say, you know, caution when thinking about this, but also the case of the Egyptian ultras, I think, is really fascinating. Of course, this was not just in Egypt, but really everywhere that we saw during the outbreak of the uprisings, that football fan groups tended to be spaces of mobilization that actually proved to be the most resilient in some ways against state and police repression, in part because they had that built-in experience over the years. But I think what's interesting now, of course, is looking back, the state learned, right? That the moment that the coup in Egypt took place in 2013, you know, the ultras were banned, and to this day, 9 years later, they've yet to be legalized or reinstated. And so now all of a sudden, football itself has become seen as an outlawed domain in the same exact way that political organizations or parties are. So there's something also to be said about the way that even kind of the sort of reaction or the repressive nature of the state tends to also adapt to this idea. And so if we start seeing these spaces as representing something more than just the revelry or the spectacle, as you said, then there's likely to also be a reaction to that as well.
Dr. Sadek, over to you. Got you back.
Sorry. Can you please repeat the question, because I cut out?
Yeah, sorry. I guess I was wondering if you can elaborate on what you mean by ummatic thinking beyond simply making the language of the caliphate and the Ummah and solidarity just familiar discursive or linguistic tropes. I'm thinking of like an organization like Hizb ut-Tahrir that has been like as far as I understand it, its entire rationale is to just make this kind of language relevant. So what do you think is missing, or what do we still need, or what exactly, or how would ummatic thinking be different, or what would it offer that would be new?
You know, that the I don't know if you're actually familiar with the Ummatics project, but that's the whole rationale behind the Ummatics Institute. All the definitions and understandings and different articulations of ummatic thinking are there in various essays and articles there on the site. So that I think would be the easy way to answer that question, because I presented. Yeah.
Sorry, perhaps just if you turn your camera off. Yes, if you turn your camera off, the audio might be a little bit better.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, much better, much better.
Is that any better?
Yes.
Yeah, sorry, as I was saying, you know, the whole Ummatics Institute project that's exactly what it tries to do is articulate what ummatic thinking is. And as far as my presentation, I think that's what I've tried to do is just present a very broad overview of the potentials for ummatic interconnectivity, given that we, at many different levels, we as Muslims do identify with the concept of Ummah. And so for me, Ummatic thinking in its broadest sense is really to think collectively as an Ummah. The fact that the idea is part of our tradition is about reviving what that means in both in our theology, conceptually, but also practically. It's about coming together. It's about we all know the famous hadith of Prophet ﷺ talked about if the body is in ill or is suffering, or all of the limbs feel the pain, the entire body feels it, so we to teach us the idea that we should have this feeling of brotherhood and sisterhood to different Muslims, and we are united by our faith. In the simplest terms, really, that's what we're talking about, really. We're talking about how we can, as a project, bring Muslims together and overcome the various differences which have become embedded over the decades and arguably the centuries. And it's not idealistic. I think it did have Ummatic unity, Ummatic solidarity, Ummatic thinking was very much a real reality for most of our history. So that's basically what it is. And then if I encourage anybody really to visit Ummatic's website to see what the various articulations are.
Okay, great, thank you. Kind of coming off of Asil's point there and her first question to Dr. Abdullah, I want to bring you in, Thomas, here and ask, you obviously spoke about Istanbul as a site of migration and the various people who are coming to the city for different reasons. How do you feel that has affected the formation of their identities and how they see themselves as people who have migrated from another country but now have Turkish citizenship or desires Turkish citizenship and see themselves living alongside Muslims from all different parts of the world?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess whatever reflections I can offer here are personal in that sense, right? So I think this is something that deserves a lot more study. And something I did want to mention is that I know of at least two people, one person who's writing a master's and one person who's writing a PhD on exactly this sort of identity formation and on imagination of Istanbul, right? But mostly focusing on, Westerners who are making hijrah. Right, specifically that term, right? Obviously, I think that sort of situation, as Dr. Sadek mentioned, there's already this concept of the virtual ummah. So there's already people that are having conversations online. But what happens is when you have one place where people are collecting together, you can have conversations on, perhaps not on a deeper level, but at least on a more personal level, right? You can talk to somebody face to face. You get a real person in front of you that you're talking to, right? And I think that the overall, what it leads to is people identifying more with the ummah, that becoming more central in their identity. And you can see a lot of this. So, for example, a lot of Turks before, obviously, it was, very nationalistic in some ways, still remains so, but you can see the effects that, so for example, I see a lot of young Turks that are now starting to learn Arabic. I see Arabs that are having informal Arabic teaching sessions all the time. And so you can see that desire there. It used to be something where if you wanted to study Arabic, if you wanted to study Islamic studies, you would have to go abroad. You would go to Jordan, you would go to Egypt. And now you don't have to. You don't even have to leave your neighborhood sometimes. If the desire is there, you have plenty of opportunities to talk to somebody from the Rohingya, to talk to an Uyghur, to talk to a Syrian, to learn Arabic, to learn about other people's experiences. And I think that identity formation just needs time. And that's about it. It's time and interaction, inshallah. And I think that is already happening to a very significant degree.
Okay, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. A reminder that you can raise your hands for questions or submit them in the Q&A box. And we've had one, which I guess is directed to Dr. Sadek. So hopefully you're able to hear this clearly. But the question is, how do we temper the idealization of the caliphate and the potential negative impact it would have on Muslims in the current nation state format? Might it be more beneficial to reframe our understanding of what is unity by appreciating fragmentation and seeing fragmentation as a net positive contributor to the Ummah? The presupposition that fragmentation is problematic is itself something that ought to be contested from a pragmatic perspective. Your thoughts on that, Dr. Sadek?
I'm not sure that I agree with the question or the presuppositions in the question. I disagree. I don't understand how fragmentation and the levels of fragmentation that we have across our societies and the Ummah as a whole is a good thing. That really baffles me. Why the questioner would ask. I mean, I don't see how can that be a net positive? I mean, it's really, for me, it's quite a strange idea. Why would that be a starting point? I mean, that's the whole problem that we have. We are divided in very divisive and dangerous ways, and this divisiveness and difference and division and fragmentation is literally killing us. I don't see how that is a good thing. Why would you want to start there? The whole point of my presentation was to suggest that we need to come together. We need to overcome these differences. Okay, there are certain levels of human difference which are inevitable and are natural, but are not necessarily problematic. I mean, we as Muslims, what we need to learn is how to overcome the different layers of our difference, and the things that we argue about developing ways in which we can minimize and tolerate very strong differences of opinion, and how to overcome things that we don't seem to have been able to do so far. And I think that is about developing common language, about developing consensus, and it's about conflict resolution, but also consensus building on the things that we agree on. That is my approach. That's my understanding, that we can do this from the bottom up. I don't personally buy into a specific exclusive political project in the way some Muslim political movements have. And I mentioned the Khilafah. I mean, the Khilafah itself is not the property, it's not the monopoly of a particular political Islamic movement, although it has been associated with one in particular. There are other movements, and we know in recent times, in the last 5-6 years, ISIS claimed to have established a caliphate. But the point is that, you know, those claims were, you know, very, very strongly contested. And I think it is up to our contemporary scholars and thinkers to explain what they mean by a caliphate. And as I said in the presentation, it was rather very much a brief kind of allusion to this. You know, I've explained it a little bit more depth in the paper, but I think the point is that I think political unity, in whatever form, if it and the language itself, caliphate, khalifa, it is up to the scholars and thinkers who are experts on this matter to explain to us. I am personally, it's not my area. I'm not a political theorist. Dr. Oveymer Anjum is here on the panel. Maybe he could maybe give a brief response to this. But the fact of the matter is that the caliphate is part of our tradition. The question is, you know, how is it relevant? Where does it fit into the various challenges and projects and issues that we need to be addressing as an ummah? For me, it's just one part of it, you know, one part of the puzzle. And in the meantime, I think Muslim unity is very much achievable, or greater Muslim unity and integration, collaboration is, like I said, it's happening, and we can do better and we can encourage it. And it's about how we can facilitate that process. I'm not into kind of utopian visions. Khilafah is a religious obligation, there's no doubt about it. It's a consensus amongst Muslim scholarship. But you know, it's, for me, that's there. What I'm interested is in how we can build from the bottom up and encourage Muslims figure out how to become more united. And I think that's for me, that's where my starting point is. And I think that's where we can develop common language. I don't think focusing on our differences, and we can spend all day talking about our differences and problems. I mean, and you know, there are entire academic fields talking about political issues and the insurmountable political problems that we have in the status quo. We all know that, but the point is, we are looking to address that, overcome that, and that's the mission of Ummatics. And I think that's what's important. And there are many Muslims around the world who want to encourage greater Muslim solidarity, and I think that's important. When I don't know how you want to take issue with that or argue the reverse.
Yeah. Let's get Dr. Anjem in on that. He had his hand raised as well. Over to you, Dr. Anjem.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. Bismillah, alhamdulillah. Thank you very much, all three of you. Just really wonderful presentations, an excellent question. In fact, that particular question about the possible benefits of fragmentation had me thinking all this time. I really loved Dr. Sadek's response of total bafflement. I think that's a wonderful response, although I have been really thinking about this question since the very beginning for years, which is, of course, in some ways, one could argue that the end of the Ottoman Empire led to the spread of Islam and an increase in the Muslim population, for example, an enormous increase and thriving in a number of different parts of the world. But the way to think about it, I think, is, look, every tragedy, every loss brings some benefit. And that's what we do with what we are given, the responsibilities and the if you will, the duty we have to God versus what we, the cards that we are handed. We must do, it's kind of like we're just dealing in a community with a large family with 8 little children whose father died. And people are talking about how this will be good in some ways for the children as a way to help the family cope with this, which is not to say that anybody should go kill the father of 8 children in order to make the children tougher. I think the Ummah, and by the way, in theology, this debate with qadr or the destiny that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has predestined, both good and bad, there's a profound discussions about this and what ought to and what ought not to be done with these kinds of things. So the question is fragmentation in itself a desideratum? And of course, when you look at the Quranic text, the Sunnaic texts, and the ulama, as well as empirical reality, much of it, you could point to all kinds of harms that come as a result of that. But at the same time, you could point to 1 or 2 benefits that come from it. And I think that we should be attentive to that as well. I'd love whoever feels strongly about it to present a paper on this, to develop the idea. And I think they will understand why people, for example, are really against the civil war, or the idea of war and killing in general, or the idea that, for example, there should be harmony in the household as opposed to constant fighting. Again, you could argue that one set of things may be really good for perhaps, for husband to fight all the time at home with his wife will make the husband a better arguer maybe in his shop. But that's not how we resolve problems, although there may be a benefit from that. But I think that, that kind of argument, and I don't mean to make light of it, really does need to be addressed academically. But I think that the more serious aspect of this question is that, look, are we talking by ummatic unity? Are we talking about eliminating diversity, eliminating real differences, eliminating the serious? How are we going to deal with, of course, the very fact that you have sectarian differences within the ummah? I think those are real, serious, valid questions. In my view, the best of our tradition shows that managing and respecting those differences does not require discord. And the way the ulama deal with these is to differentiate between ikhtilaf tanawwu', the disagreement of diversity, versus ikhtilaf tafriqa, which is the disagreement that leads to discord, which in the Quran is mentioned as the single most frequent and single biggest reason for why God punished people before and will punish people who engage in it and who fall into it. And so that differentiating line, I think that's the part of the discourse that ummatic thinking is very concerned with. And also I want to address the excellent question Asil asked earlier, what is ummatic thinking? Ummatic thinking is, of course, all about the caliphate, but about reclaiming caliphate for mainstream Islam, for Islamic scholarship, rather than letting it be abused by certain groups. So what is the idea of the caliphate, the various manifestations of the caliphate in Islamic history, but also beyond the caliphate, the idea is ummatic, that any legitimate caliphate must be ummatic. It must start with the ummah. It must start with the diversity, with the diverse needs, the experiences of the ummah, the various institutions and regional attachments and particular cultures that the ummah has developed, and how they can be still respected and brought together in solidarity. The solidarity should not mean homogeneity, should not mean a pulverizing singularity, but rather it means that, like most, I would argue that entire political theory, the field of political theory is concerned with this single fundamental question, which is how can people come together for benefit, for mutual benefit, despite having various distinct identities and differences and even perceptions of interest, right? So that is why, the modern nation state has been such a powerful engine, because it allows this idea of nationalism and how it pulverizes certain differences, but celebrates other differences in order to allow a very large number of diverse people to act in harmony in certain respects, right? That's what political theory is concerned with. And that's what ummatic thinking, in a way, is concerned with. It's just that our parameter is not the ummah or territory or worldly interest alone, but of what has been given to us as a responsibility, as duty, as charged by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Anjum, for those comments. Just before while we're waiting to see if anybody else has questions, I actually have a question for you, Dr. Abdullah. Similar again to Asil's point of perhaps looking at trying to define what is ummatic thinking. I'm interested as to how you would define ummatic spaces, because I wonder if there is a question or a risk with waiting for the ideal ummatic space to emerge, where some of these conversations can happen, without not being organized by a nation state or by capitalist Western corporations, and not only kind of waiting for that space, but then it's also happening in a way that is completely unproblematic, that we can say that there was no migrant rights abused in this case, there was no problematic Shari'i laws sacrificed for this organization of a particular event. And I wonder if us waiting for an ideal event like that to call that an ummatic space, or to take ummatic benefits from that space, will leave us waiting forever. And I wonder if there are particular things that you would look for in order to consider something an ummatic space, or indeed an ummatic site, if we were to look at Istanbul, or how does that definition affect us practically?
Yeah, no, it's a really, really great question. I mean, I think, when looking specifically at this idea of a space, this is why I really appreciated, Thomas's presentation at the beginning about Istanbul, because I think, there's a far more developed example than a one-time mega event, but one in which you actually see a city that has a history, and a long history, as well as a much more recent precedent, but I think ultimately it's a question of being a product of a set of circumstances, that oftentimes these things are happening in an ad hoc basis. I mean, I was actually going to pose the question to Thomas as he was talking about whether, the politics of the moment dictate a lot of what's happening, right? What happens if the current ruling party is out of power and all of a sudden you have a completely different set of circumstances, in place? Does all of this erode or evaporate in a span of months or years? I mean, we've already seen it in a very kind of limited way with the change of power just in the question of the mayor of Istanbul, right, of coming to power and the kind of shutting down of a lot of those quote unquote spaces that we're accustomed to seeing, or even the benefits that many refugees have had for the last kind of decade or so within the city of Istanbul. So I think in that sense, we have to have a far more malleable definition, perhaps, of the idea of a space and what it constitutes. One that, the kind of the very basic baseline probably is just a space where, people's Islamic identity tends to play some role. And again, I think I mentioned this at the very beginning, which is that it can't even be an exclusivist kind of vision, because there simply isn't room for that. And again, that's kind of a historical ideal that doesn't have any kind of basis in present situations. And so in that sense, I think the idea of it kind of being a set of other kinds of factors that might mediate this, whether it's regional, cultural, national, there's going to be a lot of other kinds of layers of these identities that should not be seen necessarily as being mutually exclusive, but should be seen as kind of complementary in certain ways. Again, in the same way where I think actually there is a reading of Islamic history that actually would empower that kind of suggestion as well, right? That the idea that it was never about simply a spiritual based identity that completely eroded things like one's geographic location or one's ethnic or cultural background, or any of these other kinds of things that also were part and parcel of the making up of identities, even going back to pre-modern times, in ways that I think tends to get kind of erased now as kind of a reaction to this overemphasis of, again, as Dr. Anjul mentioned, as far as the kind of the pulverizing effect of nationalism and the nation state in particular. So I think that in that sense, this idea of a space has to be seen in some ways as kind of being quite flexible and malleable on the basis of simply bringing people together in ways where these kinds of conversations can be had, or even not conversations, but even just expressions, right, of ummatic solidarity in ways that, again, we've emphasized already on questions like Palestine being kind of very central to this, I think, both in this example that I discussed, but also in many other kinds of places. And so even if it's kind of rallying around particular kinds of themes or issues or questions, but as a way to kind of put into practice a kind of ummatic ideal, and even in ways that kind of doesn't necessarily tend to be exclusionary of other groups or other forms of bonds or solidarities as well. So I think that's sort of how I would answer it.
That's great. Thank you. Very very interesting points made there. I think Dr. Osama, if you had a question, we'll come to you. But Thomas, would you like to respond just to Dr. Abdullah's question to yourself there?
Yeah, let's see. Is Dr. Osama there?
Why don't you go ahead and we'll
Okay,
go to
I'll just go ahead and start then. So as far as I understood, the question was basically, is this permanent, or to what degree is it a lasting effect? And perhaps I'm overly optimistic in that degree, but I do think that I think some of the effects are indeed very much lasting and will remain in effect even beyond the ruling party. In that degree, this is somewhat off topic, but I do think that there's better chances for the ruling party and the elections than most would assume, mostly because the elections are only 6 months away and the opposition still don't have a candidate even. So you have elections 6 months away and you don't even have your candidate yet. Nonetheless, an election strategy in that regard, right? But it is an interesting question. I would say that, listen, you have all these people that become naturalized citizens. You have personal ties that have already been established, right? So me personally, it's like, okay, so I've been here in Istanbul for 8 years. Let's say by some circumstance, if I have to leave Turkey, I still have relationships there that I've established that I can continue in other ways, right? I have ways that perhaps I have affected people or people have affected me. You have students, you have the opposition have made this promise that they're going to send the refugees back. I don't see that as very plausible, it's very difficult to move 4 million people at the same time, or even within a 1 to 2 year span. So I tend to be very, and I think also money talks as well. And part of this growing ummatization is also part of globalization, right? So I think a lot of this is just, it's basically turning this into a hot button issue for elections. But then even if they come to power, the degree to which they will actually be able to undo these phenomena, which as I mentioned, are not entirely the result of government policy. It is also people on the ground making decisions. It's also civil society. It's Turks themselves making decisions. You can't undo all of that. You can push it back to a significant degree. It can be, you know, a sort of 2 steps forward, 1 step back sort of situation, which obviously is not ideal, but I don't think you can ever go all the way back in that regard. And perhaps I'm a bit optimistic in that regard, inshallah ta'ala. So let's see if Sada Osama is there.
Dr. Osama, are you there? Do you have your question still?
Assalamu alaikum. I'm actually sort of in a car, so I hope I can be heard. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you fine.
Okay, alhamdulillah. So, I mean, I actually just wanted to sort of, in some respects, you know, I'm not on this panel in that sense, so I shouldn't be responding to other people's comments or questions, but I'm just wondering about Abdullah's kind of remarks as a historian. I can understand them as a historian, but I think I see the Ummatics Colloquium as a space where we're actually thinking aspirationally rather than sort of descriptively. If that makes sense. So we're wearing a normative hat rather than a descriptive one. So in that sort of context, I think it's about what meanings can we draw from these sorts of events and potentially be successful. And I think the cautionary sort of comments you made are very well taken. I just think that you know, when liberal theorists or even sort of critical theorists, or critical theorists may be the wrong example, but when people who are engaged in the process of constructing a worldview come and sit down and try and do that, it's always motivated thinking by definition, in a sense. And I don't think we need to shy away from that. I think that's precisely what we have failed to embrace for decades at this point. And it's, to a certain extent, being trained as secular historians puts us at a disadvantage. We need to get beyond that. So, I mean, that was just one brief comment. And then at the same time, the question of like the comment by Dr. Muzaffar about, you know, is the World Cup a good use of our resources? I can't remember who said this, but someone was saying, oh, why do we spend so much on election campaigns in the United States? And a commentator immediately said, well, the United States actually spends more on Pringles, consuming Pringles, than it does on, I mean, there are all sorts of strategic investments that we need to make as states. And I think, you know, Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi, rahmatullahi alayhi, you know, had something right when he said that, you know, these are things which raise the spirits of nations, as it were. I mean, or shu'ub he used, didn't really, I don't know how to, yeah, I guess nations is a good translation. And so in a sense, you know, these are strategic moments which are, you know, being constructed by nation states at this point for their own personal strategic interests, but they can be instrumentalized by people with ummatic ambition. So I just wanted to add those two, and just a final, I hope I'm not spending too much time, but the comment about pessimism and pragmatism really struck me as reminiscent of a comment that Hamza Yusuf once made. So Sheikh Hamza, this is something I treat in my own sort of book on on the Arab revolutions, but there is an unusual way, I think, a highly problematic way in which pessimism can be made normative for a lot of Muslims, and I think a lot of Muslims do that. And I kind of heard that question in that sort of spirit, but I haven't read it, so because I'm on the move. And I think that is something that we need to resist, kind of the pragmatic response to a pessimistic state of affairs, and just saying, look, what can we do to come to terms with it? That's how I understood the question. I hope those are somewhat useful comments. I've really appreciated everyone's input so far, and I've really benefited. So thank you again to the Ummatics Colloquium and to all the panelists for you know, putting this together. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you, Dr. Osama. That's a good note to end on, because I think unfortunately we are out of time. Apologies to Brother Zafar Parkar, because we just unfortunately didn't get to your question. But just before we wrap up, I'll hand over to Dr. Anjum for some closing remarks.
Yeah, thank you very much, everyone. Jazakumullah khairan. Bismillah, alhamdulillah. Once again, I want to say something about ummatic thinking. I think that Asila asked a really good question, and it sort of keeps coming back as we think about it, and it's growing in our own minds. And I like to think to myself of Eastern martial arts, when, you know, in those movies, there's always a great wise teacher who comes and changes your expectations of how to defeat your opponent by using the force, the very force and strength of your opponent against them, and to amplify the feeble powers that you have yourself. And I see the Ummatics Institute is precisely in that light, that globalization, powers of globalization are not of our making, but nobody controls where the world's heart is going to go, where people's hearts is going to move. The World Cup was not, was not arranged by Qatar for these billions of dollars for ummatic reasons, but the narrative of where it goes and what the Ummah does, for example, is still, I'm sure nobody was thinking about Palestine appearing in every match. Nobody was thinking that this is going to, I bet nobody even thought that they're going to ultimately end up banning alcohol or restricting alcohol, and that will become such a trigger for Western media. And similarly, nobody thought about Bishtgate, but it became one. And in the same way, I think that, and when the point that I take from Dr. Sadek's presentation is that the Ummah is already ummatic. What we have are inhibitors and obstructions and confusions and conflations and misplaced priorities. And the job that we see for ourselves as an academic institution, and growingly and increasingly a broader institution for the leadership of the Ummah of ummatic thinking, is precisely to provide those strategies, those spaces to come together, the encouragement to that kind of scholarship that will use the forces, often these are blind forces, and use them in ummatic ways. To that end, we also, inshallah, we're continuing, we're expanding. If you haven't checked out our new website, this is not the same as the Colloquium website, our new website, ummatics.org. And very importantly, our upcoming first annual conference in Istanbul. So that goes very well, Thomas, with the old presentation. In June, inshallah, at the end of June, around 25th of June, we're going to be announcing the dates very soon. The call for papers has gone out, so please respond to it, think about it, and use your own networks to spread the call for papers. Our first in-person conference, inshallah, in Istanbul. We hope many of you are able to join. We're accepting abstracts, and the details are there in the call for papers.
Thank you very much, Dr. Anjum, and thank you to all of our speakers today, and everybody who participated in the conversation, and everyone who attended as well. As Dr. Anjum said, we are still accepting submissions for our symposium in June in Istanbul, and I think the link to the call for papers has just been put in the chat box. So do check that out if you are interested in applying, and we look forward to receiving all submissions, inshallah. And finally, I'd also just like to encourage everybody who has not already to subscribe to our email newsletter and our social media channels, and inshallah you can receive updates about our upcoming papers and events. As we said, this is our final event for this year. So wishing everybody a blessed new year, inshallah, 2023. And we will see you in January. Assalamu alaikum.